There is something fascinating about hearing Taylor Swift talk about love when she isn't talking about it as a headline. Because Taylor has spent much of her career turning complicated emotions into music. Heartbreak, longing, regret, reinvention. The feeling of wanting someone who might never choose you. The feeling of losing someone. The feeling of finally choosing yourself. But every once in a while, Taylor writes about something different. Not the aftermath. Not the heartbreak. Not the uncertainty. But the dream itself. The private little world where everything has gone right. And according to Taylor, that's exactly what sits at the heart of one of her songs. Wish List. Taylor described the song as something deeply personal, but also surprisingly simple. She said that when she met Travis Kelce, she began to feel, in her words, like she could be a person who was allowed to have romantic whims and dreams. And that distinction matters. Because there is a difference between believing in romance as an idea and actually allowing yourself to imagine what your own romantic life could look like. For someone whose life has been watched, analyzed, photographed, dissected and turned into headlines for years, even having a romantic dream can become complicated. And Taylor's explanation of Wish List gives us a glimpse into that difference. She compared the song's chorus to the happy place from Happy Gilmore, that mental escape where everything is exactly the way you want it to be. A place you can retreat to when the outside world becomes too loud, too stressful, too chaotic, too overwhelming. And Taylor explained that the chorus of Wish List is essentially her describing that happy place. Not necessarily the world as it exists, but the world as she would want it. That is a remarkably intimate way to describe a pop song. Because suddenly the chorus isn't simply another catchy moment on an album. It becomes a picture of Taylor's ideal emotional universe. And perhaps that's why the song feels different. The verses can be playful. They can be funny. They can have that sense of Taylor enjoying the writing process and letting herself have fun. But then the chorus becomes sincere. The jokes fall away. And what remains is the dream. The wish. The possibility. The idea that maybe, after everything, she is allowed to imagine happiness without immediately preparing herself for it to disappear. And that takes us directly into one of the most interesting chapters of this entire conversation. Because Taylor didn't describe Wish List in isolation. She connected the emotional shift to meeting Travis. And that gives the song an entirely different context. Not because Taylor was saying that every lyric is literally a documentary record of her relationship. She wasn't. What she was explaining was something more subtle. Meeting someone could change what you believe is possible for yourself. And sometimes that change begins before you even realize it. Maybe you stop laughing at the idea of romance. Maybe you stop thinking of happiness as something that belongs to other people. Maybe you start imagining a life that once felt too unrealistic to even put into words. And suddenly, that fantasy becomes a song. That is the emotional doorway into Wish List. And it is also the doorway into the larger story Taylor was telling. Because while fans were hearing the music, Taylor was thinking about something much bigger. What does happiness actually look like when you are no longer running away from chaos? What does love look like when you allow yourself to dream about it? And what happens when the person standing beside you is willing to step directly into that dream? That question brings us to Travis Kelce. But before we get there is another part of Taylor's story that makes this interview so revealing. The reaction to the album. Because by the time this conversation happened, the album had already been released. And Taylor was watching millions of people react to something that had started as something intensely personal. The numbers were there. The headlines were there. The conversation was everywhere. But Taylor made it clear that the numbers weren't the only thing she was watching. She was watching people. Real people. Fans responding emotionally to the music. People hearing something in a song and immediately understanding it. And that, perhaps more than any statistic, seemed to matter to her. So if you're a Swiftie who loves following not just Taylor's biggest headlines but the stories behind the music, this is exactly what Taylor Timeline is here to follow. Because sometimes the most revealing Taylor Swift stories aren't the loudest ones. Sometimes they're hidden inside one sentence about a song. One memory. One relationship. Or one unexpected moment on a stage. And this story has all of them. The timing of the interview is important. Taylor was speaking only days after the album's release, which meant that the entire world was essentially reacting to her music in real time. Fans were discussing songs. People were forming opinions. The album was becoming part of the cultural conversation. And Taylor knew exactly what that meant. She said she welcomed the chaos. Then she described a rule of show business that captured her attitude perfectly. If it is the first week of an album release and people are saying either her name or the album title, they're helping. That doesn't mean every opinion has to be positive. And Taylor was surprisingly open about that. She said she has a lot of respect for people's subjective opinions about art. She even described herself as not being the art police. Everyone, in her view, is allowed to feel exactly how they feel. And that idea connects directly to the way she thinks about her audience. Because Taylor doesn't seem to describe an album as something that has only one correct interpretation. Instead, she described the goal of entertainers as being a mirror. And that metaphor is incredibly important. A mirror doesn't tell you what you're supposed to see. It reflects what you bring to it. And according to Taylor, an album can work the same way. What you are experiencing in your own life can completely change the way you hear a song. The same album can mean one thing to you at 20 and something completely different at 30. A song that once seemed distant can suddenly become painfully personal after a major life change. A record you once didn't understand can eventually become your favorite. Taylor gave examples from her own catalog. She talked about fans who once didn't relate to Reputation but later went through experiences that made the album feel completely different to them. She mentioned people who once saw themselves as fearless girls and later became obsessed with Evermore. And there is something beautifully revealing about that observation. Taylor isn't just making music for the person you are today. She is making music for the person you might become. And that is one reason she said she has such a strong eye on legacy when making her music. She knows what she made. She knows that she loves it. And she understands that the meaning of that work may continue changing as listeners change. That's a very different way of looking at success. Because success can be measured immediately. Charts can tell you what happened this week. Numbers can tell you how many people listened. But legacy is slower. Legacy belongs to time. It belongs to the moment when someone discovers an old album years later and realizes it suddenly says exactly what they are feeling. And Taylor said that she is making this music for keeps. That phrase says a lot. She isn't simply thinking about the current news cycle. She's thinking about the body of work, the larger story, the canon of albums she has created. And that idea becomes especially interesting when the conversation turns to Easter eggs. Because Taylor has built a relationship with fans where the music doesn't necessarily end when the song ends. Sometimes there is another clue. Another image, another number, another visual, another detail waiting to be noticed. And in this particular case, fans had plenty to look at. One of the most fascinating moments in the interview came when the conversation shifted toward the album's visual world. Taylor had directed the video connected to the album cover reveal. And according to her, the process wasn't simply about making something visually beautiful. She had a list. Not 10 things. Not 20. More than 100 Easter eggs. Think about that for a moment. More than 100 details that Taylor wanted to place into the video. And she described going through that list one by one during the production design process. Checking things off. Making sure they were there. That is the kind of detail that helps explain the relationship between Taylor and her fans. Because for many artists, an Easter egg might be a clever little extra. For Taylor, it can become part of the architecture of the entire project. A visual can connect to current art. A reference can point toward something from the past. A small detail can suggest a future possibility. And Taylor said that this is essentially the realm of her Easter eggs. Current art, past art, future art. And the fans know it. They know that when Taylor puts something into a visual, there may be a reason. That doesn't mean every single detail has only one possible interpretation. It means the audience has learned to pay attention. And Taylor clearly appreciates that attention. She said she feels honored that fans care so much about the canon of the album she's made, and even about plans she may have for the future. But perhaps the most revealing part was what came next. She said that as long as the Easter egg hunt remains fun for the fans, It will be fun for her to plan. That sentence tells you something about the relationship between Taylor and Swifties. The clues aren't only about Taylor hiding information. They're also about Taylor creating a game that her audience can play with her. She puts something into the world. Fans search. They debate. They connect dots. They come back with theories. And then, sometimes much later, a detail suddenly makes sense. That's part of the experience. It's a shared language. A kind of long-running conversation between artist and audience. And that makes the album roll out more than a simple release. It becomes an event. A world. A puzzle. Something fans can continue discovering after the initial excitement fades. But there was another part of Taylor's world that was even more personal. A part that couldn't be reduced to Easter eggs or album numbers. Love. And when the conversation finally turned toward Travis Kelce, the story became much more personal. Because before Taylor ever talked about the relationship from her perspective, there was another person who apparently had a role in helping the two worlds collide. Her mother. The story of Taylor and Travis has become one of the most recognizable celebrity relationships in the world. But Taylor's version of the story, as presented in this conversation, begins in a surprisingly ordinary way. Someone named Travis Kelce came up. Taylor's mother was told about him. And the response was apparently immediate. He was described as incredibly nice. And there was one detail that stood out. He really loved his mom. That was enough to get a reaction. A very enthusiastic one. The response was essentially, "That sounds promising." But then came the practical question. How do you actually get Taylor to meet him? And this is where the story becomes especially funny. Because Taylor admitted that she had always been very much a non-athlete. Not because she had some elaborate opinion about sports. Simply because she wasn't one. She wondered what she would even talk about with an athlete. That is an incredibly relatable concern. Imagine meeting someone whose entire world revolves around a sport you barely understand. What do you talk about? What questions do you ask? How do you avoid sounding completely lost? But then came the nudge. Taylor described the call from her mother as having a tone that essentially communicated, "You need to do something different. There is a guy. He's really cute." And Taylor's response wasn't exactly the reaction of someone who had been waiting around for a football player to enter her life. She was skeptical. But then something happened that caught her attention. Travis had come to her show. And he had brought something from his world into hers. Taylor said that she thought that was incredibly sweet. And that gesture apparently said something to her. Because he wasn't simply asking her to step into his world. He had already shown up in hers. That matters. Especially when you consider what Taylor's world actually looks like. The scale of her performances. The crowds. The attention. The pressure. The sheer intensity surrounding an Eras Tour show. And here was Travis, an athlete from a completely different universe, showing up at her concert. Then came the first date. And Taylor's introduction to football was apparently memorable. She said Travis had to explain football to her as if it were violent chess. That description immediately paints the picture. High speed. Aggressive. Strategic. A game where everyone is moving at once and somehow the people involved know exactly what is happening. Taylor said the explanation helped her understand it. But then came the part she probably didn't expect. She became obsessed with him. And therefore, she became obsessed with learning about football. That is where the story changes. Because it wasn't simply Taylor learning a sport. It was Taylor learning a world because someone she cared about was part of that world. And that is a theme that comes up repeatedly in the interview. She wasn't an athlete. She wasn't initially a football person. But curiosity changed the equation. And suddenly, football wasn't just football anymore. It was part of someone's life she had become deeply interested in. That brings us to another question. What did Travis bring into Taylor's world? The answer would turn out to be something fans would never forget. He brought himself onto the Eras Tour stage. And somehow, it became one of the most unexpected moments of the entire tour. Taylor's Eras Tour was already a massive production. But the idea of putting Travis Kelce into the show was something else entirely. Because Taylor had a specific vision. She had written a skit for I Can Do It With a Broken Heart. And the concept was deliberately theatrical. Taylor described imagining herself as a soldier on a battlefield. She would be fatally wounded. She would die on stage while singing. Then the performance would shift into a dramatic, cabaret-style, vaudeville-inspired sequence where she would suddenly have to perk up and continue performing. It was dramatic. It was theatrical. It was intentionally over the top. And Taylor had a thought. If there were ever a moment to put Travis into the show, this might be it. But she wasn't going to ask. Because, as she explained, that could be a little intimidating. There is a difference between joking about your partner appearing on a massive international tour and actually asking him to walk onto the stage in front of tens of thousands of people. So the idea apparently began as a joke. Travis would go up there. He would participate with the dancers. Everyone would laugh. Except then it became clear that Travis wasn't joking. He actually wanted to do it. And Taylor's reaction was essentially, "Wait, you would actually do that?" The answer was yes. And suddenly this wasn't a hypothetical anymore. It was happening. Taylor told him that if he was serious, she would send his measurements to wardrobe. He said, "Put me in." That simple attitude became one of the defining characteristics Taylor described about Travis. He's a yes guy. Someone who is willing to participate. Someone who doesn't immediately back away from something because it's unfamiliar. Someone who seems to enjoy the moment. And that quality mattered enormously once the lights came on. Because performing in front of an Eras tour crowd is not a small thing. The lights are bright. The audience is enormous. The expectations are enormous. And yet Taylor said Travis seemed completely comfortable. She described him as someone who comes to life when the lights are brightest. That was something she had noticed about him. And it was something people had apparently noticed about him as an athlete too. The idea was that big moments don't overwhelm him. Instead, he becomes even more present. Taylor connected that quality to his ability to slow down time in stressful moments on the football field. And then she watched him do something remarkably similar on her stage. He went out there. And he performed. Not as a football player. Not as Taylor Swift's boyfriend. But simply as an entertainer standing in the middle of one of the biggest shows in the world. And Taylor's description of what happened was glowing. She called him charming, delightful, magically entertaining. She talked about his instincts. She said he was someone you would want on stage with you. And then there was the reaction. The crowd erupted. And Taylor made one claim that immediately puts the moment into perspective. She said it was, as far as she could safely say, the loudest everybody got during the Eras tour. Think about the scale of that statement. This was a tour filled with enormous moments. Surprise songs. Emotional performances. Costume changes. Thousands of fans singing every word. And somehow, the appearance of Travis created a level of excitement that Taylor herself remembered as extraordinary. But there was something deeper about the moment. It wasn't only funny. It wasn't only unexpected. It wasn't just a celebrity cameo. Taylor described Travis as one of the happiest people she had ever met. And she said that she adored that about him. She described him as someone who brings happiness into the room. Into his circles. And on that particular night, he brought happiness to thousands of fans. That is why the moment mattered. It wasn't simply that Travis Kelce appeared on stage. It was that he seemed completely willing to step into Taylor's world and play along with it. And Taylor, in turn, seemed genuinely delighted that he did. And now we can return to the song. Because after hearing Taylor describe Travis, the Easter eggs, the album, and the Eras tour moment, Wishlist starts to feel like more than a song title. It becomes part of a larger idea. Taylor described the song's chorus as her happy place. A mental space where everything is exactly what she wants. And she connected the beginning of that kind of romantic dreaming to meeting Travis. That doesn't mean the entire song should be treated like a literal relationship timeline. Taylor was talking about emotional possibility. About allowing herself to have romantic whims. About imagining. And that may be one of the most revealing things about the way she talks about love. Because Taylor has spent years writing about relationships after something went wrong. She has written about the beginning, the middle, the ending, the aftermath. But here she was describing something different. The fantasy of happiness itself. The place you go when the world is too chaotic. The place where you don't have to defend yourself. Where you don't have to calculate the next move. Where you can simply imagine that things work out. And maybe that is what makes the song resonate. Everyone has a version of a happy place. For some people, it is a person. For others, it's a home. A memory. A future they haven't reached yet. A life they are still hoping to build. Taylor's explanation makes the chorus feel like her own version of that place. And suddenly the title, Wish List, takes on another meaning. A wish isn't necessarily a prediction. It's not a promise. It's an expression of desire. It is the thing you allow yourself to imagine when you stop worrying about whether it is realistic. And that connects beautifully with what Taylor said about becoming someone who could have romantic whims. The important word there is could. Permission. Possibility. A willingness to dream. For someone living under the constant microscope of fame, that kind of freedom may be especially meaningful. Because Taylor's romantic life has never existed in a vacuum. Every relationship becomes public. Every photograph can become a headline. Every lyric can become evidence in a fan theory. Every appearance can be analyzed. So the idea of having a private happy place becomes even more powerful. It's a space where imagination belongs to her. A space where she can decide what happiness looks like. And then she can turn that feeling into art. That is what Taylor said she does. She creates something personal. And then she lets the audience hold it up like a mirror. They may see themselves. They may see someone they used to be. They may see someone they hope to become. And that's why the same Taylor Swift album can mean something completely different to different people. The song doesn't have to be one thing. It can become yours. There was another thread running underneath Taylor's comments about the album. Gratitude. She acknowledged that fans had made people happy with the release. She talked about how unbelievable the fans had been. And she expressed genuine difficulty in finding the right words to thank them for the way they had responded to the music. What seemed to stand out wasn't simply that people listened. It was how quickly they connected. Taylor said fans had immediately gotten it. That matters because releasing an album is, in some ways, an act of vulnerability. An artist spends months or years creating something. Then eventually, the work leaves the studio. It belongs to the public. And once that happens, you can't control what people feel. Taylor explicitly acknowledged that. She respects subjective opinions. Some people will love a song. Some won't. Some will connect with one era of her career and not another. And then life happens. People change. Their circumstances change. Suddenly an album that once meant very little can become the soundtrack to an entirely different chapter. That's the mirror. And perhaps that's also why Taylor doesn't seem to want to police the reaction. She welcomes the chaos. Because the chaos itself means people are engaging. They're talking. They're interpreting. They're feeling something. And for an entertainer, that engagement is part of the process. But there is a difference between numbers and human connection. Taylor was asked specifically about that. How does she absorb the reaction when an album becomes this big? How does she process the sheer amount of energy being poured into it? And her answer brought the conversation back to something very human. She talked about the people, the fans, the interaction, the emotional response, the fact that these songs are landing inside actual lives. And that may be the most important part of Taylor's philosophy as an artist. The numbers tell you how many people heard something. The human reactions tell you what it meant. One is measurement. The other is connection. And Taylor has always been deeply interested in that connection. When Taylor said she has an eye on legacy, that may have been one of the most important statements in the entire interview. Because legacy changes the way you think about a career. If you're only thinking about this week, you chase the immediate reaction. If you're thinking about the next decade, you think differently. And Taylor clearly understands that her albums don't exist independently. They are chapters. One leads to another. Fans carry pieces of one era into the next. A person who once identified with Fearless may later find themselves living inside Evermore. Someone who didn't understand reputation at one point in their life may eventually discover that it speaks directly to them. That's what Taylor means when she talks about the mirror. The music changes because the listener changes. And the listener changes because life changes. So when Taylor talks about doing this for keeps, it isn't just about one album. It's about the entire body of work. The entire story. The canon. The choices. The details. The Easter eggs. The visual language. The songs. The relationships. The memories. And even the moments that seem completely unexpected. Like Travis Kelce walking onto the Eras Tour stage. Because that moment, too, becomes part of the story. A football player entering a theatrical world. A non-athlete becoming fascinated with football. A boyfriend becoming a performer for one night. A crowd exploding with excitement. And Taylor watching someone she cares about step into her world without hesitation. It is almost a perfect example of what she was describing earlier. A life where different worlds collide. Music, football, love, performance, humor, chaos, happiness. And perhaps that's why the happy place idea feels so fitting. Taylor's happy place isn't necessarily a world without chaos. She explicitly said she welcomes chaos. Her happy place may instead be a world where the chaos feels worth it. Where the people around her bring joy instead of fear. Where the work still feels meaningful. Where fans still care. Where she can still surprise herself. Where she can still write a song about a romantic dream and let millions of people hear it. And where, every once in a while, the person beside her is willing to put on a tuxedo and walk onto the biggest stage imaginable simply because it sounds fun. Perhaps the most memorable part of Taylor's description of Travis wasn't even the fact that he appeared on the Eras Tour. It was the way she described his personality. A yes guy. Someone who is up for things. Someone who doesn't seem intimidated by the size of the moment. Someone who can turn pressure into entertainment. Taylor said that he is one of the happiest people she has ever met. And that he brings happiness into rooms. That's significant because happiness is the theme connecting so much of this interview. The happy place in Wish List. The joy of fans discovering Easter eggs. The happiness Taylor feels when people connect with her music. The humor of Travis appearing in the Eras Tour. The excitement of the crowd. The sense that Taylor herself is allowing more room for joy. These aren't isolated details. They create a pattern. And that pattern is what makes this story interesting. Because for years, Taylor's public narrative has often been dominated by conflict. Who said what? Who broke up with whom? What does this lyric mean? Who is this song about? What happened? What went wrong? But this conversation spends far more time talking about something else. What if things are simply good? What if the story isn't about surviving the chaos? What if it's about enjoying the chaos? What if the person you meet doesn't add another complication to your life, but gives you another reason to laugh? What if the relationship doesn't make you smaller? What if it gives you permission to be playful? That is the emotional world Taylor was describing. And perhaps that is why Wish List becomes such an interesting piece of the puzzle. Because the song represents imagination. The Easter eggs represent play. The fans represent connection. And Travis, in Taylor's telling, represents a willingness to participate in that world. Not perfectly. Not seriously every second. But joyfully. When you strip away the headlines, celebrity relationships can become surprisingly ordinary. Someone meets someone. They become curious. They learn about each other's interests. They laugh. They try something new. They discover that the other person makes them happy. But with Taylor Swift, none of those moments stay completely ordinary. Millions of people are watching. Fans analyze every detail. Every song can become part of the conversation. Every public appearance can be turned into a theory. That's why her explanation of the happy place matters. She wasn't simply giving fans another piece of gossip. She was explaining how she thinks about the emotional side of songwriting. And she was giving context to a song that, on the surface, might sound playful but become sincere in the chorus. The verses can make you smile. The chorus asks you to believe in something. That's a powerful combination. and it mirrors Taylor's description of her relationship with Travis. There is humor. There is curiosity. There is football. There is a theatrical appearance on stage. There is the ridiculousness of a football star suddenly becoming part of a cabaret-style Eras tour performance. But underneath all of it is something much simpler. Happiness. Taylor said Travis brought a lot of happiness. And on that particular night, he brought it to a stadium full of people. That may be why the moment has such emotional staying power. It wasn't planned as some enormous historical event. It started with joking around. Then someone said yes. Then wardrobe got involved. Then the lights came up. And suddenly Travis was standing on Taylor's stage. Sometimes the biggest memories begin that casually. There is a temptation with Taylor Swift stories to search for hidden meanings in everything. The number on a door. A color. A costume. A lyric. A gesture. A date. An expression. And sometimes that is part of the fun. Taylor herself clearly enjoys the Easter egg culture surrounding her work. But this interview offered something different. Instead of asking fans to decode every tiny detail, Taylor actually explained what some of it meant. She explained the emotional inspiration behind Wishlist. She explained the philosophy behind her music. She explained why Easter eggs are fun. She explained what she admires about Travis. She explained how he ended up on the Eras tour. And perhaps most importantly, she explained how she views her audience. As people who bring their own lives to the music. That means there isn't necessarily one secret answer. Sometimes the meaning changes. Sometimes the listener changes. Sometimes the song stays the same while your life transforms around it. And maybe that's why Taylor said she knows what she made. She adores it. But she also knows that the audience will take it somewhere she can't completely control. That's the deal. That's the risk. That's the beauty of releasing art. You make it. You love it. You send it into the world. And then you watch people make it part of their own lives. So we come back to where the story began. The happy place. The place Taylor described through the chorus of Wishlist. A mental escape. A personal utopia. A place where everything is exactly how you want it. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about that idea is that a happy place doesn't have to mean a perfect life. It can simply mean knowing what you want. Knowing what brings you joy. Knowing which people make you laugh. Knowing which memories you want to hold on to. Knowing what kind of future you are willing to dream about. Taylor's explanation of Wishlist suggests that, at least in this chapter of her life, she became more comfortable imagining those things. She began to feel like someone who could have romantic whims. Someone who could dream. Someone who could picture happiness without immediately questioning whether she deserved it or whether it could last. And that is a powerful evolution. Because sometimes growing isn't about becoming tougher. Sometimes it is about becoming softer. Allowing yourself to hope. Allowing yourself to be surprised. Allowing yourself to be happy. And perhaps that's why the Travis story fits so naturally into the conversation. Not because he is the entire story. Taylor is still the center of her own story. Her music. Her choices. Her creativity. Her fans. Her legacy. But he became part of a chapter where happiness was something Taylor was willing to talk about. And then, almost unbelievably, he walked onto her stage. He said yes. He wore the costume. He performed. He made the crowd laugh. And Taylor watched it happen. A football player in a Taylor Swift show. A moment that probably sounded ridiculous before it happened. And yet once it happened, it felt completely natural. That may be the real lesson of this entire conversation. Sometimes the things you never expected to fit into your life become the things you remember most. Swifties don't just follow Taylor's career. They follow eras. They remember details. They recognize references. They watch for clues. And they grow alongside the music. That's exactly the relationship Taylor described when she talked about fans revisiting albums years later. Someone can change. Their interpretation can change. Their favorite album can change. And suddenly a song that once felt distant becomes deeply personal. That is why an album release can become much bigger than the music itself. It becomes a reflection point. Fans hear Taylor's stories and compare them with their own. They hear "Wishlist" and think about their own happy place. They see the Easter eggs and start searching for connections. They watch Travis appear on stage and experience the surprise alongside everyone else. And then they talk about it. They share it. They debate it. They turn it into memories. That is the ecosystem Taylor has built. And according to Taylor, she is honored that fans care enough to participate. She isn't pretending that she controls every interpretation. She welcomes the fact that people bring their own experiences to the music. That is what makes the relationship between artist and audience so unusual. The work begins with Taylor. But it doesn't end with Taylor. Maybe that's why this interview feels bigger than a conversation about one song or one relationship. It's really a conversation about where Taylor Swift is emotionally as an artist. She is thinking about legacy. She is thinking about the body of work. She is thinking about how fans change. She is thinking about how they interpret music differently as their lives evolve. She is thinking about Easter eggs and future possibilities. And at the same time, she is talking about something incredibly simple. A happy place. A romantic dream. A person who makes her laugh. A football game she had to learn. A first date where football was explained like violent chess. A man who was willing to step onto her stage. Those details make the larger story feel human. Because behind the stadiums and records and headlines, there is still a person writing songs about what she wants. And maybe that's what Taylor was trying to communicate with Wishlist. Not that everything is perfect. Not that life has stopped being chaotic. But that even in a chaotic life, there can be a place you go mentally where everything feels right. And sometimes art is simply the act of describing that place. The Eras Tour moment with Travis is almost the perfect final image for this story. Taylor had created a theatrical world. She had imagined the scene. She had written the skit. She had planned the production. And then Travis stepped into it. He didn't need to be there. He wasn't required to do it. He could have laughed and said no. Instead, he said yes. And Taylor's description of him suggests that this willingness is part of what she loves about him. He doesn't seem afraid of the moment. He doesn't shrink when the lights become brighter. He gets bigger, more animated, more entertaining. And Taylor saw that quality not only as an athlete, but as a person. The result was a moment that made an enormous audience incredibly happy. And Taylor remembered it as one of the loudest reactions of the entire Eras tour. That's not just a funny anecdote. It's a snapshot of two worlds colliding. Music and football. Performance and sports. Taylor's stage and Travis's willingness to step onto it. And underneath all of that is the same word that keeps returning throughout the interview: happiness. Maybe the most beautiful part of this story is that the happy place Taylor described isn't necessarily some distant fantasy anymore. It can also be a memory, a song, a stage, a crowd, a person standing beside you, a ridiculous joke that suddenly becomes real, a football player putting on a tuxedo because he thinks it would be hilarious, a stadium exploding with laughter and applause, and an artist looking back on the moment and realizing just how much happiness it brought. That's the thing about dreams. Sometimes you imagine them before you know whether they are possible. Sometimes they become songs. Sometimes they become Easter eggs. And sometimes, somehow, they become real memories. Taylor Swift's career has always been about transformation. One era becomes another. One version of Taylor becomes another. One album changes the way fans understand the previous album. And now, in this chapter, she is talking about something that feels less like transformation through heartbreak and more like transformation through happiness. The freedom to dream. The freedom to have romantic whims. The freedom to let someone into your world. The freedom to learn something completely outside your comfort zone. And maybe most importantly, the freedom to laugh. Because for all the enormous moments in Taylor Swift's career, sometimes the moments that stay with people are the unexpected ones. A song that suddenly becomes sincere. A fan finding themselves in an old album years later. An Easter egg that finally makes sense. A person walking onto a stage when nobody expected it. A crowd screaming. And Taylor, realizing that someone she cares about had brought an entirely new kind of happiness into a place already filled with music. That's the story behind the happy place. And perhaps that's what makes Wishlist so interesting. A wish doesn't have to be something you are waiting for. Sometimes it becomes something you already lived. Sometimes the dream becomes the memory. And sometimes, years later, you can look back and realize that the thing you once imagined as your perfect little escape was quietly becoming your real life. For Taylor, the story is still being written. And if there is one thing Swifties have learned after all these years, it's that every era eventually becomes part of a larger story. The songs connect. The memories connect. The people connect. And the fans are there for all of it. So as Taylor continues building the legacy she says she has her eye on, perhaps the most interesting question isn't what the next Easter egg will reveal. Maybe it's what the next chapter will feel like. Because if Wishlist is Taylor describing her happy place, then the most fascinating part isn't simply figuring out what is hidden inside the song. It's watching what happens when an artist who has spent so much of her career writing about surviving the chaos decides that, this time, she wants to welcome it. And maybe that's the most Taylor Swift thing of all. Not escaping the chaos. Finding happiness inside it. This is Taylor Timeline. And whatever era comes next, Swifties will be watching.